Well, I think a lot of things inspired me to get in. Certainly the work that the IAF was doing in Texas, it really inspired me a lot. I think that what I saw happen in Pilsen during those early years of the 70s when I initially got introduced was breathtaking. The transformation in the people. I remember years later, I would say 15 years later, I ran a discussion with many leaders, maybe 40 or 50 people that I had known in Pilsen neighbors throughout the years that were still around. And we did a whole evening of recollection of people who had been transformed. And we filled up an entire wall. I mean, it just went on and on and on. People who were now in government, people who had returned to school, people who had bought a home, people who were running an agency, people who'd become organizers. It was just overwhelming. And I think that experience as a leader of about 6 or 7 years was transformative for me. It turned me from this wimpy, frightened, house-centered human being, raised by 2 immigrant parents, to a public person with a public life and a public attitude and the capacity to articulate my fight and my anger. And I had never realized that in the world there was a place where that could happen, and I didn't even know it was supposed to happen. I figured power people were power people because somebody gave them the job, because their father had a lot of money, but that it was never, I wasn't born into that. And somehow I understood, I think as a young person you had to be born into it. And I wasn't born into it. I was born into a tortilla making, baby making industry. And that's that's the path I was on. I was an obedient daughter. I was doing exactly what I was prepared to do.
And so that experience turned that upside down.
I mean, the Catholic church I was in, there was this crazy priest who used to drag me to meetings, kicking and screaming. And I was frightened. I didn't want to go, but he'd say, I just need you to just come. What about the children? We're bringing the children. I'll be by to pick you up. We'll take the children. So he was initially the one, and he had already captivated my mother. And my mother and I used to hang around a lot together at this stuff. So we would go together, and I'd feel some security in the fact that we were there together, And that happened. And the other things that happened that I think helped me was during those years, my mother was in a phenomenal struggle with what to do about the severely disabled brother I had. And he was now growing up. He was a teenager, and he was becoming violent. He was frustrated. His brothers and sisters were dating. They were going to school. They were getting married. They were doing all kinds of things. And he couldn't go out. He couldn't go to school. He didn't have friends. And he had the mentality of a 5-year-old, but he knew he was different, and it made him angry. And he was big, huge guy, and strong, and didn't understand his own strength, and didn't understand he could hurt someone. And my mother was desperate to find something, and there was nothing. But in 1968, the law was passed in the state of Illinois that forced the public school system to support financially community-based institutions who could provide services if they could not provide the service. Well, my mother and I got involved with someone who said he could help us, and we created our first school for Bobby, for my little brother. It was a not-for-profit in the neighborhood. And then we created the second one. Both of them are huge and flourishing now. They're very big major agencies, but in those days they were just nothing. They were just a group of people trying to do something. But to win those and to get funding and everything was not just a matter of asking for it and filling out a form. We were being rejected and denied because it was an acceptable practice to reject and deny a Mexican community in those days. They would ridicule us publicly in meetings if we didn't speak English. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff. So all of my practice as a leader that I was just beginning to learn, I was being agitated by the very organizers I was working with in Pilsen Neighbors. Well, kick their ass. Why are you permitting this? Yeah. And I'd go back and think, oh my goodness, yeah, I need a different approach. And so I wound up with my mother and many, many other people just in a series of actions to try to gain recognition so that we could establish these agencies for people with disabilities. And so we won them. in the midst of my trying to learn how to organize, I also did these other projects. And they were not part of Pilsen Neighbors. They were another part of my life. I was using what I was learning in Pilsen Neighbors, I was applying over here. Agitation, a vision, an attitude, a push. I tell a story all the time when I'm training. I must have been maybe 8. And I lived in a tenement building up on the 3rd floor. It had 4 floors. And on every floor there were 4 apartments. And the hallways were always dark because the light bulbs would go out. And the janitor was an alcoholic. He was a funny character, but he was always drunk. And so the garbage wouldn't get picked up, and the hallways were always pitch dark, and we'd have to feel our way down the hallway. And
Yeah.
So my mother always had something to say to the landlord. And the landlord hated the tenants. He was cruel to everyone. He was a very wealthy man, just cruel to everybody. And I remember one day we saw him coming, and we were afraid of him as little kids.
Yeah.
Oh, here comes the landlord. We'd scatter up the stairs. We're just hoping whatever he does, I hope he's not coming to my house.
Yeah.
And so run in the house, close the door. Okay, we're safe. And then I hear the bang on the door.
Oh.
And I go and I hide in the closet. And my mother comes to the door, and I'm watching through the crack. There's my mother at the door, and the landlord immediately sticks his finger in her face because she had reported him because of the garbage. There were rats. It was a horrible place. And he starts shaking his finger in her face and saying to her, "You and your brood are going to wind up in the street tonight. You keep this up." And my mother just right in his face. You know, she wasn't screaming at him. She wasn't swearing at him. She was saying, "You take your finger out of my face. You know, I pay you rent. You have got to do your job. You're not on time." And this man is just screaming at her. And my father comes, and I'm watching through this crack, and he's standing behind my mother, and he was a very quiet man. And I can hear him whispering to her in Spanish. My mother shushing him away and saying to him in Spanish, "If you're not going to help me, get back, you know, give me space." And I remember, here was my feeling. I was terrified that we would wind up in the street. And so excited to see this soft, warm, tortilla-making mother of mine be a grizzly bear. And I think, when I think back, I think that had a severe impact, a real impact on me. Say, hey, you can be a mother, you know, you can cradle your babies, and you can kiss them and make them sandwiches, and also you can kick somebody's ass if they fuck with you. So, and I have that vivid image of my mother at that door, just a bear. Just, you mess with me and you're going to be sorry. You're going to pay. Right? My father, my mother, both wonderful people. But watching them be ignored, be talked down to, be ridiculed, because they were immigrants. Because what did they know? They're stupid, they're Mexican, and they're immigrants. And I was a kid, but I remember having an image that somebody was going to pay. When I was about 12, I remember that feeling like, I'll grow up.
Someday.
I'll grow up. Profession that you get to learn about the world, you get to be curious about what makes people tick, you get to learn about politics and about history and about, you get to learn all about the real heroes of this country, the real heroes, right? And it's not the ones that we're taught about in the history books in the schools, but you get to learn about what really shaped the nation, what created public policy, when dents were made in movements, and movements begun out of those.